So it's a real pleasure to hand things over to Dan Blumstein and to introduce him as well so he can introduce our guest. Dan is a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at UCLA. He also co-directs UCLA's Evolutionary Medicine program. He co-directs that with Barb Natterson-Horowitz. And Dan and Barb are on our committee that organize Club EvMeds. And this is an offering from their institute, from their center out at UCLA. And I want to turn things over to Dan to introduce our main speaker today.
Thank you, Charlie and Meredith, and thank you all for coming today. So this is one of those and now for something completely different talks, or maybe not, because I think most of us are pretty broad thinkers here. And basically, Terry and I have been part of a group that was founded well over a decade ago by the late Sagarin, which we ended up calling a Darwinian security or natural security working group. And what we aim to do through a series of meetings, we had one recently, what can we learn from 3.5 billion years of evolution and millions of evolutionary products about security and society? And these discussions were really interesting and included a multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary group of people that focused on everything from network science and health policy and homeland security, security people, defense people, and top-ranked scientists from a variety of different disciplines. This is a picture from one of our maybe first or second meeting. In any event, I then met Terry, and we've been corresponding for years and working on a variety of different projects over the years. Terry has a diverse history. He was a career officer in the UK military. He was a chief bioweapons inspector in Iraq for a while. He's been recently on the UN Security Council dealing with terrorism threats and dealing with nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. He also serves on the several boards of companies dealing with therapeutics or rapid testing rather for agricultural and diseases really. And he's the founding president of the International Council of Life Sciences. And I'm going to hand it over to Terry to sort of introduce some lessons that we've learned really and approaches one can take to dealing with crises, sort of like pandemic threats. The Natural Security Project has led to several things, including a book that Rafe and Terry edited called Natural Security. And I would say the sort of Cliff Note version, actually much better than the Cliff Note version, but with sort of Rafe's summary of many of the lessons that we sort of generated are encompassed in this really wonderful book, Learning from the Octopus, How Secrets from Nature Can Help Us Fight Terrorist Attacks, Natural Disasters, and Disease. And it's really approachable and a really great introduction to a very interdisciplinary way of thinking. So with that, I'll just hand it over to Terry, and he's going to talk about some high-level lessons that apply to things like in pandemic threats, and including have insights for our current dealing with COVID. Terry.
Dan, thank you very much, and thanks to Club EvMed for allowing me to participate. As I'm not an academic, I suppose your best description is a practitioner, but I just lay out the general concepts, and from that, which we draw from the lessons from 3.5 billion years of life in all its great variety, and then give a real world example of how the ideas can be translated into action through regional infectious disease surveillance systems. And so the principal concepts are laid out here on this slide, and the idea of them being organized semi-autonomously with little central control. That varies, of course, depending on the organism that we're talking about. A really important point we find that one thing by studying the history of biological evolution, certainly something I've learned, is they learn from success, biological systems. We in our world as humans focus a great deal on analyzing failure, spend a great deal of time doing that. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't do that, but we don't spend enough time looking at success And you can't fail to obviously examine successes when you look back through organisms through their whole history and how they continue to survive. And the way they use information to mitigate uncertainty, because they're living in a world of wide variety of risks, which are hard and impossible actually to predict. So they use information in a way that they can mitigate uncertainty, and I'll give some examples of that later. And symbiotic partnerships are found everywhere in nature, and this is how they extend their natural adaptability. And an important point, not to give a personality to biological systems. Of course, they don't plan or predict or perfect. But that last word we learn through our work, that the care one must take in searching for optimum solutions can be costly and really very expensive. And so nature doesn't generally do that, where they have to survive and of course reproduce and continue to live against a variety of risks. And I think this phrase, rules of engagement, is something that Raphael Sagarin, the founder of our group, is that everything is variable. So variety is really an important element to take into account. If we're looking at the current COVID-19 epidemic, for example, where we're looking at a global laboratory right now, and we're only halfway through the game. Sorry to use a sporting analogy. So we don't know which ones approaches which will work best in dealing with this novel pathogen that we're wrestling with at the moment. But the lessons we'll get from the variety of approaches, of course, one size won't fit all, and there'll be a variety of approaches which will be successful. The idea that we can't eliminate risk. So my fundamental idea behind all of this is that the fundamental concept is learning to live with risks. Risks can't be eliminated. That shark in the picture you see to the right there can't be turned into a vegetarian. You have to find a way of living with risks, and there are various fish which of course feed on the shark itself and clean its teeth and so on, and the shark doesn't eat them. So that's a rather simplistic idea. But that, again, the important point, I reiterate again, it doesn't perfect, it doesn't plan. The more optimum the solution, the less adaptability one has, particularly in dealing with the unexpected. And in the next rules, natural solutions are nested and recursive. It's a rather mathematical expression in that, but they adapt from the same, each organism has their own genome, and of course it's nested in that, and it adapts from that, but keeping the main basic genome and being recursive and learning over and over again. And natural solutions evolve many times or appear everywhere. And there you see the example of the human eye and the eye of the octopus. And so in looking at diverse solutions and dealing with the environment and dealing with the unexpected, we should look for things that occur many times. And if we were to take these rules and moving to the next idea, just to put things together, so we must deliberately organize to be adaptable, transform uncertainty into advantage. Risk can be an advantage, and there's certain elements within that, and something that Dan and I and others are looking at fear as an advantage, which is dealing with particularly with uncertainty and risk where we don't know the full implications of it. And we learn through a process of selection and use this symbiosis to stretch adaptability. So that's how to operationalize, but it has to be done deliberately. Adaptation, I've heard CEOs, I've heard commanding officers in my military life saying we must be adaptable. They don't actually go into detail how it's to be done. And moving on, I'll give an example here. The Middle East Consortium for Infectious Disease Surveillance, which I was involved at early stage of its evolution, here, Israel, Jordan, and Palestine collaborated together. You can imagine the politics of the situation. I'm not going to explain it, but at the top government level, collaboration was not possible on a challenge they were facing in the early 2000s with infectious diseases arising from food and waterborne disease. And that was a starting point, a common starting point, but the governments were not able to collaborate directly. And eventually, through reaching out through the non-profit community, Search for Common Ground in East Jerusalem, I was working then as the Vice President for Global Health and Security at NTI in Washington, DC, and they approached us to see if we could bring money and expertise together to create a cross-border epidemiological surveillance system, where they could work together, scientists and public health officials working together. And we just look at how that was done. And the real people who made this happen are the gentlemen in the front row in the photograph at the bottom. On the left is Alex Leventhal of Israel, then the Director General for International Cooperation in Public Health, the gentleman in the center, Adel Balbizi, who was head of the Public Health Organization in Jordan. And on the right, Dr. Assad Ramlawi, who was the Director General of Public Health in Palestine at the time we started it. He's now the Deputy Health Minister there. This was formed independently from the bottom up. The outsiders were facilitators, really. I was involved in writing their standing operating procedures, where natural needs really trumped the politics. It was not in opposition to the politics. The government leaders knew exactly what was happening, and we knew our limits to what we could do. And they focused on contact tracing across borders. It began with food and waterborne disease, and then continued to avian influenza, to human influenza, leishmaniasis, on all these diseases. So today, it's working on all those aspects, and it's happening, if you like, not exactly below the radar, but because there are direct contacts and trust has been built. There have been training together of Palestinian, Jordanian, and Israeli on diagnostic, laboratory staff on diagnostics, so they could trust each other with their diagnostic capabilities. This idea then through the World Health Assembly, which is happening this week, by the way, in Geneva, and they met people from other parts of the world, and the word got out, and through symbiosis, and from this, the Mekong Basin Disease Surveillance Network was built. If you look at that map with the Mekong River going down the center, the World Health Organization dealt with this, with those to the west of the Mekong were dealt with from Delhi, from their regional office. Those to the east were dealt with from their regional office in Manila. But what they really needed to do was to collaborate directly with each other. And they learned from the Middle East Consortium for Infectious Disease Surveillance, those 6 countries there. We have funding, mainly private funding for this. The Rockefeller Foundation was a major financial supporter of this, but there was funds from other sources as well. And particularly important here was the contact tracing, the direct cross-border collaboration without having to go through the capitals to make this happen. So that contact tracing was carried out, and visas were pre-approved and so on. The whole system was built covering all sorts of diseases. And the same was picked up in Africa. This is the Southern Africa Center for Infectious Disease Surveillance. The priorities are different in these different areas. Here in Southern Africa, the big interest, or the starting point for them, you have to have a common starting point. And that was the disease transmission from the wild animal population through to domestic agricultural animals through to humans. So the focus is very much on zoonotic diseases, but the same sharing system, contact tracing, diagnostic training, as was set up for the Middle East consortium, was carried out here. And now this has come under an overall heading of, without it being centrally organized, but just an organization to exchange data, exchange best practices, and things like that, called Connecting Organizations for Regional Disease Surveillance, which is led by a nonprofit called Ending Pandemics, with money coming from all sorts of various sources, including the Skoll Foundation in this case. This led, in our work, we obviously thought about global solutions. Here you see the UN Security Council, where I spent 5 years in support of bringing scientific and technical advice in connection with global terrorism issues. But one has to recognize the limitations of these political organizations. We can't live without them. We have to have them, but the limitations have to be fully recognized. And again, this idea of decentralization and having issue networks which operate cross borders is hugely important. If we think about the World Health Organization, and I'm sure some of you will be following the World Health Assembly discussions that are going on already. The World Health Organization, 70% of its funding of its activities come from voluntary donations by government. Only 30% of it comes from the basic contributions that all UN member states have to make. So it shows how dependent they are on support. And you might have heard today that China's granting $2 billion to COVID-19 work over the next 2 years to this idea. So I think these limitations need to be recognized, but there's a great deal of success, a great deal that can be done, like organizations like you, Club EvMed, and I've participated in other organizations, and the academies of science working across borders is another source where these things can be done, despite the great political difficulties and obstacles that may lie in their path. I'll stop there, and I think Dan and I will be ready to answer questions. We put a question there, Dan. I don't know if you want to add anything just at the end.
No, I would just say, we're sort of taking a deep, broad perspective to these broad questions, and what are characteristics of successful solutions? What are characteristics of less successful solutions? What can we learn? And I think the crux here is, as Terry sort of began implying, is we're also dealing with politics. So Terry and I were talking earlier, and it's sort of like, what's the role of politics? And, how do we depoliticize things? We see many, Slack channels of biologists and other people working together globally in a much more frictionless way. But when it comes to implementing policies, governments get in the way of that. And that sort of got us thinking about, how do organizations function, and what do we look at when we're looking at organizations, which could be political organizations or countries or other sorts of organizations, and thinking of responding and how organizations respond to pandemics and epidemics. So just broad, high-level questions. Terry included a paper that he and Rafe wrote, for thinking about some of these things as well. But really, this is sort of a different perspective, or what we hope to generate is a different perspective on a discussion about some of these ideas. So with that, I'll just leave it to you folks and open it up to questions and discussions, and we can pretty much go anywhere with this.
Okay, something that occurred to me as I was listening to this presentation. Thank you very much, Terry, for sharing this. As an evolutionary biologist, as a comparative biologist, one of the things that occurred to me is that I can think of two ways that animals deal with challenges, at least long-lived animals, and that is having larger brains, right? Having a bigger brain to deal with these challenges, and social learning, learning from others, some crucial bit of information, for example. And we know that social learning occurs throughout the animal kingdom. I mean, it varies in different, in degree in different species. We obviously know that brain size varies. I was just wondering if we know anything about the link between brain size and predictability, let's say, of the environment, or social learning and predictability of the environment. I don't know if you know that, Terry, or if Dan knows anything about that, or maybe there are others.
I mean, certainly, phenotypic plasticity is valued in uncertain environments because learning is costly. There are studies that look at adaptability and plasticity in a comparative aspect, but I think the lessons sort of have to be sort of higher level from 30,000 feet rather than even 10,000 feet at the size of brains when dealing with and trying to apply these to solve or think about perspectives or frames on social problems. And I think one of those lessons is that social learning can be a very powerful and rapid accelerator, but it need not necessarily be adaptive. So if we think about, everyone going around and saying, excuse me, I want to wear guns and not wear masks, that might not be the best thing if we're trying to, control a pandemic. But nonetheless, it's something that seems to be spreading rather quickly. And I think that our social media and our technology, which is allowing us from all over the world to have a discussion right now, which allows scientists all over the world to work together on dynamic 24/7 collaborations that are leading to really rapid outcomes and study of the COVID pandemic, also can lead to the spread of conspiracies. So social learning is something that can be weaponized in a good way or a bad way, and collaboration can be weaponized in a good way or a bad way. And I think we have to sort of, think about the two sides of that. And certainly many of, I think, the interesting problems really are behavioral problems right now. And the behavioral scientists, I mean, scientists know what to do. We have a recipe for dealing with this. But dealing with the complexities of human leads to the whole sort of human behavioral science literature. There's a paper coming out in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, which is a fascinating review of different insights from basically human behavior on dealing with things like this.
Just a question, do we know anything about on the biological side of things about how, like I think Carlos Botero was studying some of these kind of questions about predictability of environments and brain size, and maybe there's something as well on social learning and the predictability of the environment. I mean, it's really a question more about biology than the human side. Do we know if that?
Yeah, Carlos was looking at variation in the environment and breeding systems for sure, cooperative breeding, and he published, insights on that, looking at variation in cooperative breeding, so social behavior. I don't know if he looked at brain size per se. Daniel Souls looked at brain size and urbanization and tolerance to urbanization, and because in urban environments, suddenly animals are faced with new environments and more variation in some ways. All of these seem to be associated with that. The comparative brain size, and actually even the comparative cognition literature in terms of big, broad-scale reviews, I think is underdeveloped and is something that will lead to more stuff. So people have been looking at brain size and plasticity in that way. I don't think they've been thinking about social learning per se in that perspective yet. Correct me if I'm wrong, anybody.
Looks like we do have a comment in the chat box that there are a handful of papers that show a relationship between brain size and ability to cope with novel environments. So at least
Daniel Soul, Benson, Sarah Benson, yeah.
Yeah, so at least some research out there.
So maybe there's work to be done on the social learning side, the broad comparative studies of social learning and predictability of environments or whatever the outcome variable is here.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I think that's an area, and in fact, Dan, you've done some work on this, and that how fear plays a part. I just mentioned very briefly that fears can be an asset, but of course it can also be a downside to it. But looking back through the plague history, and the human responses to it, there are lots of common factors that come up, going right back to the Justinian plague days. And right through the Black Death and up to more recently, the 1918 influenza pandemic, which John Barry wrote an excellent book on, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. So how fear plays into it. And there's another human, this speaks to the social learning part, but another member of our group, Dominic Johnson, wrote a book like God is Watching You. And in his approach in there, that a part of the success of human evolution is through the cohesiveness brought through supernatural agents. He says in his book, there's not a single community or ethnic group that we know about that hasn't had some form of supernatural agency. So it's built into our evolution from our earliest days of coalescing in groups, and as partially, a source of our success. Some would argue that, of course, there are religious wars and so on. It doesn't actually lead to too much success.
Great, thanks for that. It looks like we do have a question from Michael Reiskin. Michael, go ahead.
So forgive me if this is a naive question because I'm not all that familiar with thinking about this stuff, but in this framework, what would the units of selection be? Like policies that are instituted by different groups, or is it ideas like Dan was just talking about with regard to, we're going to take our guns and our masks and go to the state capitol, or whatever?
Well, shall I have a go, Dan, and then you might want to follow? It's a really good question, and really speaks to the heart of our work. And we focus the learning to human organizations. So I would say it's all of the above. Certainly the policies in the current pandemic. Lots of different approaches are being used. You would expect them to be different because the circumstances are completely different in many countries. There's no one size fits all. And so yes to policies, and certainly ideas, ways of thinking about issues, and very practical things about maintaining adaptability, preparing for the unexpected, all these other ideas that are present in nature and successful species in nature. So all of those things.
I would just add that I think we're undergoing a global group selection experiment now at some level, where there are national policies or state policies. These differ, these have consequences, and rather than saying there's going to be one answer, we should expect there'll be multiple answers. That context really matters. That there's not just one way to solve a pandemic. There's a recipe book, but then there's context. If you have a country with a good healthcare system, some things may work better than others. If you don't have a good healthcare system, other things may be better to have an economy at the end of a pandemic as well. So these are complex, nuanced things, but I think looking at the diversity of life, we see there's not one solution to a problem. And I think that's a recognition that hasn't been sort of out there as much.
You need the diversity, right? Because that's what is selectable.
Yeah. So
I think, go ahead, Dan.
No, go ahead, Terry.
Well, all I was saying, I was taking another example, particularly in relation to policy and practical action, and my experience in the counterterrorism field. And if you look at the way that terrorist groups have responded to action taken against them, if you were thinking of Al-Qaeda or to ISS later, where at periods of time they've occupied territory, building a caliphate and so on, but then have morphed in response to that they've been deprived of the territory, but continue to live in another way, maybe less effectively and less of a global threat. That would perhaps be a reality to draw from it. But the adaptation that terrorist groups, particularly ideological ones, that can promote, in other words, ideas. I'm glad that was brought in by the first questioner there about the point about ideas, because that's how this Al-Qaeda and ISS promote their way of life, that they promote a religious approach. And how do governments respond? Which governments are necessarily going to be less adaptable to this. But we need to learn from this and change the policy to go through. And one can see that happening in my own experience of dealing with terrorism with the UK government, that novel ideas often come from the most unexpected places. And that's part of the genesis of my thinking and being involved in this project.
Great, thanks for those responses. It looks like we have a question from Noga Aharoni. Noga, you're unmuted, you can go ahead.
Hi, Terry. We actually met in the India-Pakistan dialogue. I was Gigi's intern, if you remember me. So I'm a microbiologist, and I love the attention that we're getting right now. I was wondering, in these days when any study can make the headlines, how do we ensure that people understand what's done and its limitations? And how do we also ensure that the policies that are made are actually based on the science and really stem from understanding those limitations?
Well, shall I have a go first? Because that's at the heart. I've been living for most of my latter part of my professional life at the point of intersection with policy and science and technology. The answer to you is with great difficulty, but we have to find a way of ensuring that the evidence, the scientific evidence, gets to the policymakers. Far easier said than done, but much of this can be done by, as I was saying, the transnational networks that exist. I remember reading an excellent book by Jean-Francois Richard, who's written a book about distributed networks, and saying with the pace of developments in science and technology, that this is the way that real change is being brought about, whatever the politics of the day may be. So I think we have to think about this as a long-term issue. If we're thinking about the pandemic at the moment, people are making judgments now. And we're halfway through the game. Maybe we're not even halfway through. We may be less than that. So making judgments now, hasty judgments and accusations and blame, and looking at the charts that are produced, looked at like a football league table, is very dangerous. But I think it's going to be up to the scientists. I certainly sense that through my personal networks, whether it's through business or through things like the American Biological Safety Association, which is actually ABSA International now. And there are various networks, and these are really important and not to be underestimated. And they establish norms which eventually might influence and develop regulations. We certainly did that in my work in the Security Council, not at the high political level, but we went around the world with scientists and experts with us to try and influence best practices and good practices in countering, preventing technologies getting in the hands of the wrong people who might do harm with it instead of doing good. But I think that's where it lies. I know this is a very generalized answer, and there isn't a very specific one, but your question is really very good, but it's all about education. But what we learn from nature is that bottom up is the way this is done. I couldn't imagine is sitting in a room with Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians, and the subjects we were talking about, and sitting in a room when a Gaza conflict was in progress, yet we were talking about practical, everyday collaboration. So I've seen in practice how this can work.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So it looks like we have a few raised hands. So we'll go next to Adam Hunt. Adam, you're unmuted. You can go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Terry. Yeah, Adam Hunt. I'm going to Zurich's Institute of Evolutionary Medicine. So this is really interesting, and I love the idea of applying the concepts of evolution kind of outside biology. I'm reminded of the three necessary principles which are required for evolution to take place in the first place, which are heritability, variation, and differential success. And thinking about how that would apply in this kind of policy context, because it seems like, we'll use the example of coronavirus just because it's topical, but the variation obviously is different countries' policies, and we can kind of observe how they play out. The differential success obviously is how the virus is spread or not. But then, the heritability is then whether people copy it. But I'm just wondering, with variation, it seems like evolution does really well by having thousands and thousands of possible variations of strategies, and then the best ones get adopted. But obviously it's much harder to do that in the kind of global security context, or in responding to these kind of health crises. We only have, say, maybe 10 or 15 different approaches. Sweden obviously is playing out an experiment of their own. So yeah, the one thing I'm wondering is, like, how applicable can this difference in variation be to this kind of policy level? Also, I don't know if this relates to what you were talking about with bureaucracy in the World Health Organization, because if you have one organization who decides the tactics, it seems like we have no variation. We just have one tactic, and therefore we can't allow this evolvability to take place. And does this imply that the World Health Organization should recommend 100 things and then pick between the best of those and then vary again, etc.? I'm just wondering, and also then going to the political point of, like, heritability, how likely will foreign governments be to copy other governments once they see that a strategy is successful? You get this extra, like, political element of being able to, like, adopt the correct strategy or not.
So I just want to comment on one thing and then give it over to Terry to talk about sort of WHO implications. The thing that I fall over on thinking about this as a great global group selection experiment is it's an open system, that people are moving around. And even in the US, I mean, a particular neighborhood, I mean, so Northern and Southern California, the Bay Area versus Los Angeles. I'm in Los Angeles. I walk around my neighborhood and $4 million houses are still being built. People have dog groomers coming to their house and drive-through dog groomers and drive-through car detailers. It drives me absolutely crazy. I mean, it's just silly. In the Bay Area, they shut down pretty much most of the construction. And if you've looked at the rate of increase, it's declining in the Bay Area, and we continue to have more COVID deaths and cases in the LA area. So you can imagine that there actually is much more variation than we think. Even in this administrative unit called California, different areas are doing it differently. So really it's about learning from the successes and failures of these, the challenge of which is that people are driving to and from and flying to and from the Bay Area to Los Angeles, or I hope to be going to Colorado to re-engage in field work in next week, late next week. But people are coming from all over the country and world, into Colorado now. So it's sort of too much of an open system. So that provides a challenge for understanding this, but nonetheless, other systems are open as well. And I think that we can learn from the degree of openness and closeness. Whatever North Korea is doing is North Korea's solution. But the rest of the world's much more open. Terry, why don't you address the comment about the role of the WHO, which I think is a really astute one.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that great question and comment. And I always learn from these things. On the WHO, they're not going to come up to a single solution for everybody. They wouldn't attempt to do that. Just to explain, just very briefly, how it works. That there are things called international health regulations, and that's where there is a coalescence on to do something. There is the International Health Regulation 2005, which requires, it's legally binding, which requires all states to report an infectious disease outbreak of international concern. And I won't go into the detail of how they define that, but at least all the governments in the World Health Assembly got together to say they should do that. So when a country gets an outbreak, they should report it. And there's also a system for support, and they also have to have certain standards for being able nationally to diagnose an outbreak, diagnose the nature of the pathogen and so on. So there's pressure to do it. I mean, the implementation of this international health regulation passed in 2005. It's not perfect implementation globally. That's an example of some basic global requirement. Now, beyond that, it's very hard for the WHO to do anything else. They're not going to come up to a single solution for everything, and they shouldn't, because this is what evolution tells us, that that a variety of solutions are needed in a variety of contexts. Perhaps my remarks made you rather pessimistic about international cooperation, but actually governments do cooperate. They do actually learn from each other when the chips are down. It may be very much at the last minute, and it's in the context of all sorts of other dimensions of politics, which may be economic and maybe territorial disputes and so on. But again, I've seen this in action. If we were to take the Mekong Basin Disease Surveillance Network, Vietnam and China have a very testy relationship. And so do all the countries with China in that group of the 6 countries. But they have a set of standing operating procedures which are made to work. And they're not dealing with Beijing, they're dealing with the government in the province Hunan on the border through which the Mekong River flows. So it's done at that level. And there's successful collaboration. And lots of learning and training goes on in this area. So I'm really optimistic. We're in a world where passage of information, here we are talking, I don't know how many countries are involved, Meredith, right now in this discussion, but in my groups that I work with, the technology that we're using now, and of course the public's learning much more about it in this current context, is one of the successful counters, which arises naturally. In a way, it's from the bottom up. So you've given us pause for thoughts on your question about the 3 principles, but I'm glad you mentioned the success one, because that's the one which we need to focus on and draw on. But variation is essential, and there's no one solution for this problem we're faced with now, and many other problems. This is not like it. Infectious disease is perhaps in a particular context of its own. If we're thinking about a huge earthquake, this is one of the unexpected outcomes, like the tsunami and Southeast Asia and across the Indian Ocean, for example. Lots of international collaboration very quickly in that context, because people are not, say, in London or in Washington, D.C. or Los Angeles, we're not directly affected, although Los Angeles might be, should there be an earthquake, makes me think about it. But so this is a different category. I know, Dan, you want to say something. This is where I think this issue of fear and the public response to it, which we need to be very cautious about, because it could be an aid, but it's also one of the challenges we face in finding the variety of solutions we need, which suits different countries and different regions.
I think the sort of fear that everyone is vulnerable to this may be a motivating agent and also may be a polarizing agent, and how that plays out in international collaborations and tribalism broadly is really, I think, important to consider and think about. As Terry said, an earthquake or a tsunami or a devastating fire somewhere is very different. Everyone rushes to aid wherever they can. But here, everyone's vulnerable, so our behavioral, defensive systems go up, and got to make sure I'm safe first. And where is this coming from? And then we start naming things and giving things pejorative names, and sort of the best and the worst of our inner primate begin coming out.
I think there's another issue. Sorry, I don't want to prolong this, if people are waiting for for other questions. But there are other lessons from nature, having a certain amount of redundancy to deal with the unexpected. And so I hope one big lesson we may learn from this is that I'm old enough to remember there were fever hospitals, and people who had, because there's a higher endemic infectious disease burden when you go back many decades when I was young, and there were, people with fever went through a separate system in England to fever hospitals. They weren't going to the emergency place in the casualty in a hospital, the emergency section. So there was something that was learned from history of having fever hospitals, which disappeared in the UK in the 1950s. And there was a downside. So as threats are apparently remote, then it's a more difficult challenge. I won't get it. I don't think we need to open this up too broadly, but I think climate change is one of those which for many people is remote. It's not a risk they see today unless you're living on a Pacific atoll somewhere. So for most people, it's not an immediate threat.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for those responses. So we have a couple more questions. I know people have had questions for a while. Hopefully we'll be able to get to them. Next up, I think we had Jay Laboff. Jay, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Meredith. So I have two questions, and I think they're related to the conversation that just happened. The first one I posted on here, which says infectious diseases are clearly biological. I would also add they're inevitable, if not predictable. Can an evolutionary perspective be used to deal with other limited kinds of resources? For example, in 1999, the U.S. Academy, I worked for the National Academy of Sciences in the U.S. The U.S. National Academy of Sciences, Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities, the Palestinian Academy for Science and Technology, and the Royal Scientific Society of Jordan jointly published a book called Water for the Future, the West Bank and Gaza Strip, Israel and Jordan. And you can I indicated the URL where you can download it. But this is a different kind of limiting resource. This is figuring out how to share water in the Jordan River. And I'm wondering whether there are lessons that could be learned if we try to think about other kinds of limited resources, not just infectious diseases, and how individuals, institutions, and nations have dealt with it. The second question that I have that I think is related is, does your initiative include experts from the behavioral and social sciences? And the reason I ask again is that when I was at the Academy, following the September 2001, we published a report that was called Terrorism, Perspectives from the Behavioral and Social Sciences. And what it tried to point out is that the behavioral and social sciences can contribute to a lot of the political policy and other kinds of discussions that were going on at the time where behavioral and social scientists felt that they were being excluded. So I was just curious whether you're using that kind of perspective.
Dan, I could perhaps take on the first one if you'd like to go with the second. Is that okay? Well, on the first one, you chose a super example. The collaboration you mentioned was in the background of our work with the Middle East Consortium for Infectious Disease Surveillance. It showed that such collaboration could transcend the very difficult political circumstance of the time. And the same idea was drawn on for the Mekong Basin Disease Surveillance Network, because there is a Mekong Basin disease water management process there, which has been operating for many decades now. But again, some of the threads of that were picked up and adapted for use in the infectious disease context. So we're using, I think the lesson we drew from it, there were threads of something that we could adapt and build on for this purpose. And this could also be built on for other purposes as well. And so I think you highlighted a really important point. Our problem when we were building the infectious disease surveillance network was the lack of knowledge, that people weren't aware of them, and there were ideas that were being superimposed. And I remember that it hindered us in the South Asia context. We were trying to do a similar thing with India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and so on. But it got overlaid by people not being aware of what was going on at the lower levels. So there are tricky issues there for that. But I'm glad you brought that up, because it's a lesson. I could say yes to your second question, but Dan, would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, for the first question, I would say I think you got it in one. When there are limiting resources, when there are shared constraints, we see naturally all sorts of collaborations. So in the anti-predator literature, you see all sorts of different species working together or using information from other species to deal with risk collectively in many cases. Think about mobbing birds, for example. So I think that we should expect so from a policy perspective, expecting these, facilitating them, not putting up barriers to them, encouraging them, realizing that these can be ways to solve interesting solutions is great. I mean, it would be horrible if countries decided to shut down internet pipes between countries right now to control information. That would not be a good thing. But by allowing information to be spread, there's a lot of good stuff being spread. There's some bad stuff being spread. That's the cost of doing business. Yes, the social science is essential. We had some of the founders of the field of evolutionary psychology. We had anthropologists, other social scientists, people from all sorts of different social science disciplines. To me, dealing with COVID right now, it's the human behavior that has more unknowns or known unknowns than maybe the epidemiological models. I mean, epidemiological models, given the proper data, we know what to do with them. We have a recipe book for dealing with pandemics. It's really not that hard. Why isn't it working globally? It's the human behavior. So I think the human behavior is, and understanding the human behavior more and capitalizing on that and understanding both the positive aspects of human behavior and the negative aspects of human behavior and trying to manage those, to me, are the challenges that we face. We have human behavioral scientists, social scientists are essential in dealing with common threats and pandemic threats particularly.
Yeah, just a quick commentary. One of your bullets said natural needs trump politics. And I think the two key words, and particularly as it pertains to here, are Trump politics. And I worry about how that's going to be.
Yeah.
That's just my political.
Great, thank you. So I know we're running short on time, but we do have one last question that we'll try to fit in. I know Ed LeGrand has had a question for a while. So Ed, you're unmuted, go ahead.
Okay, Adam Hunt brought up a very interesting concept of having a diversity of strategies. And I've been interested in this in terms of stress that, say, bacteria might experience when they're hit with antibiotics, when tumor cells are hit with chemotherapeutics, when the Irish population is hit with a famine, or when the human population is hit with COVID-19. So I've come up with 4 basic strategies for handling stress or potential threats. And if somebody can come up with another one, please let me know. Number 1 is ignore it. And if you guess correctly, you'll win, or you can lose. 2, try to oppose it. So in COVID, it would be develop antiviral therapies and have people pay for it. The main one, it seemed to me early on, was go quiescent, just hunker down. And the 4th one is leave the stress. So Irish potato famine, if you look at that, well, a lot of people left Ireland, go quiescent, you're not going to eat much, you're going to wait it out. Trying to oppose it, you would, if you think it's coming, you would plant more, you would be more thrifty, or you could go on with your life. And if you guessed right that it was not going to be a problem, you'd come out ahead. So ignore it, oppose it, go quiescent, or leave. Those are the 4 that I've come up with. They're all applicable to what we're talking about today, it seems like.
I love that approach. I mean, that's sort of the high level approach of sort of lessons from life that we sort of have been, thinking about. Of course, going quiescent means never leaving your home. And we also know from life, you have to leave your burrow at some point. Otherwise, you're going to starve when you're actually facing a threat. So the challenge is, the devil's in the details, but this sort of a punch list to analyze a particular question, you can ignore non-existential threats. Can you ignore existential threats? We know that pandemics are existential threats. The US military's recognized these as civilization killers and a huge threat to our own security. And I'm sure Terry could say that every other military in the world recognizes that as well. So depending upon the nature and scale of threat, this sort of punch list is absolutely a wonderful recipe for thinking about, how to deal with threats. I love it.
If I may come in, I agree with what Dan has just said. I think it's a really interesting idea you put forward. I don't know that I can add to your 4, but of course, like the population of Ireland, not everybody did one of those things. So there was a mixed response to them. So there was a variety to it. So Ireland survived and the population survived. But it did prompt me to think about a couple of other things. I always love the cicada example, and I don't know whether you call this quiescent or ignore, certainly not ignore, but with cicadas that come up annually, every 3rd year, every 7th year, and every 13th year. And so that some will survive whatever may be happening on the surface. So I think there's an insect response which embodies all of those. But I wanted another idea and more recent exchanges I've had with the University of Southern Denmark, where there's a group working on vaccination policy and vaccination practicalities, where they've done studies on vaccines, live vaccines stimulate the immune system in a way that goes beyond their specific purpose. So if you use a live vaccine for a specific disease, whether it's smallpox or tuberculosis or something else, then if it's live, it will be more successful in stimulating the system, which the immune system will have wider effects, where specific kill vaccines don't do this. And they've done a lot of work on this. And I'm not sure where that fits in your 4 suggestions, but I thought it was just an interesting idea to bring up at the end.
I like the idea that there's a combination of them, or an individual's strategy may change depending on, over time. So it's not just one throughout the whole course of the stressful event.
Okay.
And another lesson from life is constantly acquire and update. We're all Bayesians. Successful organisms are Bayesians. We modify our responses based on new information, and we should be doing that. And how we get this new information can be from our internal abilities to acquire information. We could get information from others. We might value that more or less. The value of information from others might be valued more or less based on context. So all of these are things we see in how animals respond to predation risk, which you can view as an existential threat, and give us insights on how to manage our own existential threats, we think.
Do you have a paper on this stress, your idea you've just expressed, Ed?
Well, in that paper, I only expressed going quiescent as the strategy, and the others occurred to me later. So I
Time for a new paper.
Yeah, that's it. We look forward to the new paper.
Okay, everyone, I think we should, this has been a great conversation, but we are now over the hour, so I think we're going to wrap things up. Terry and Dan, I just want to thank you again for a really fantastic discussion. Definitely a new topic for Club EvMed, and I think a very productive one, so thank you very much for that. And thanks to all of you for these great questions and discussion in the chat box of the Zoom. And of course, I want to thank Meredith for organizing and keeping us on track and keeping everything organized. So thank you very much, Meredith. We do have 2 more Club EvMeds coming up. Next week on Tuesday, the 26th, we have Athena Aktipis from ASU, and she'll be talking about her new book that's out on cancer. So another new topic for Club EvMed. And then after that, the week after that in June, the first week of June, we have Sean Carroll on June 3rd. And so that'll be another one that I think will be a fantastic conversation. And of course, we are working very actively to fill up the rest of the schedule for June and July. So please let us know if you have any ideas. And thank you all again for showing up. It's great to see such a great turnout and such a great discussion. Stay tuned.
Thank you.